There's a moment in every athlete's life when talent alone isn't enough. When your arms are strong enough to hit a backhand down the line, when your legs can chase impossible balls, when your mind understands the geometry of victory. But your bank account? Your bank account tells a completely different story. Alex Eala lived that contradiction every single day. She was 17 years old when the realization hit hardest. Her rankings were climbing, tournament invitations were arriving, scouts were whispering her name in the corridors of professional tennis. But watching her play from the stands was becoming a luxury her family could no longer afford. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. The Philippine tennis circuit had given Eala everything: the foundation, the hunger, the fundamental brilliance that made coaches stop mid-conversation and stare. But it couldn't give her what the international stage demanded: unlimited resources, travel, coaching, training facilities, accommodation in expensive European cities where the best competitions happened. The cost of chasing a dream at Eala's level wasn't measured in hundreds or thousands. It was measured in sacrifices that families remember forever. Her parents worked relentlessly. They made choices that ordinary families don't have to contemplate. Which tournament could she skip? Which coaching session could wait? Which plane ticket could be delayed? Every decision was a calculation, not of tennis logic, but of raw survival economics. They watched their daughter compete on courts where opponents arrived with entourages, with nutritionists, with physical therapists, with families who could afford to be present. Meanwhile, Eala's loved ones had to make peace with watching the most important moments of her career through a screen or not at all. The heartbreak of that reality extended beyond money. It was about presence. It was about a father unable to sit courtside and watch his daughter battle. It was about a mother missing the exact moment when her child's backhand slice finally worked the way it was supposed to. It was about family, the thing that every athlete draws strength from, being just slightly out of reach, separated by distance, by expense, by the brutal mathematics of economic disparity in professional sports. Yet, Eala never complained. She didn't demand. She didn't fall into the trap of entitlement that sometimes consumes young athletes with obvious talent. Instead, she carried that weight silently. She played harder. She trained longer. She channeled the frustration of inadequate resources into pure determination. The girl from the Philippines was proving that hunger could compete with funding, that grit could rival privilege. But something was changing in the professional tennis world. People were watching Eala, not just coaches and scouts anymore. The veterans were noticing. The legends were paying attention. And among them, one man in particular had begun to recognize something familiar in this young woman's struggle, something that echoed his own journey, something that demanded action. He had already changed the sport once. Now he was about to do something that would redefine what mentorship truly means in tennis. Rafael Nadal didn't announce his observations. He never posted them on social media. He didn't hold press conferences about which young players he was monitoring. That wasn't his style. His attention worked differently. It was precise, methodical, almost surgical in its accuracy. When Rafa watched tennis, he didn't just see strokes. He saw hunger. He saw obstacles overcome. He saw the invisible architecture of a champion being built, piece by piece. For years, Nadal had been quietly constructing a philosophy on tennis that extended beyond winning matches. He understood something that transcended rankings and trophies. The sport needed new legends, and legends couldn't emerge from poverty alone. They needed belief. They needed access. They needed to know that somebody who had already conquered everything, believed in their potential enough to invest in it. Rafael Nadal's own rise had been cushioned by privilege in ways that international audiences didn't fully appreciate. He had family support, he had early sponsorships, he had Rafael Nadal Sr. guiding him with strategic brilliance. He had resources that allowed his talent to flourish without the financial suffocation that destroys so many promising careers. He knew this advantage wasn't universal. He'd watched it destroy potential for decades. When Alex Eala burst onto the international junior circuit, something clicked for Nadal. Her technique was elegant, but unrefined in the way young players always are. Her tactical awareness was developing, but her resilience, that was something else entirely. It was the kind of mental toughness that can't be taught in academies or purchased from specialists. It emerges when a person has already been tested by real hardship. Ayla had been tested. Nadal observed how she conducted herself on court despite the obvious disadvantages. He watched interviews where she talked about her family's sacrifices without bitterness, only gratitude. He saw her gratitude not as weakness, but strength, the kind of strength that made him want to act. The decision wasn't spontaneous. Nadal wasn't the type to make impulsive gestures, regardless of how it might appear to the outside world. Behind every charitable act was calculation, strategy, purpose. He understood the symbolism of what he was about to do. He understood how it would reverberate through tennis. He understood that this single action could become a catalyst for change, not just for Ayla, but for the entire developmental structure of women's tennis. What Nadal recognized was simple but revolutionary. Talent without access is tragedy, and tragedy, when preventable, becomes a crime of omission. He had the means to prevent it. The question wasn't whether he would act, it was only how dramatically he would do so. He chose maximum visibility. He chose unmistakable generosity. He chose a gesture so bold that it couldn't be ignored, minimized, or forgotten. Because Nadal understood another truth about sports legacy. Sometimes you have to break the system to expose its flaws. Sometimes you have to spend your own money to highlight that others should spend theirs. The preparations began quietly. Nadal made calls, he coordinated details, he ensured that what was about to happen would serve not just Ayla, but every young player fighting against the same invisible walls. The stadium was already electric. Tennis fans had arrived hours early, anticipating a compelling match. They had no idea they were about to witness history being written in a way that had nothing to do with the scoreline. Then, the announcement came. An entire section of premium seating, not the cheap seats, not the standing room areas, but the prime courtside positions that typically cost thousands of dollars, had been purchased. Completely, in full, by Rafael Nadal himself. And not for personal use, not to create some VIP experience for himself or his circle. The tickets were going to Alex Eala's family. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. Confusion transformed into realization. Realization became emotional eruption. Fans in the stadium gasped. Social media ignited before the match even began. Tennis Twitter exploded. Instagram flooded with clips. The image of Ayla's family entering the section, their shock, their tears, their disbelief, became the story larger than any match could be. Nobody had seen this coming. Not the media, not the tournament organizers, not Ayla herself, who learned about the gesture minutes before stepping onto the court. The preparation had been so secretive that even industry insiders were blindsided. Nadal had orchestrated it with the precision of a military operation. Maximum impact, zero warning, unstoppable narrative dominance. But here's what makes this moment truly revolutionary. Nadal didn't just buy tickets. He purchased an entire section to ensure Ayla's entire family could experience this tournament together. Parents, siblings, extended family members who had sacrificed alongside her. They weren't scattered throughout the stadium like ordinary attendees. They were together. They were visible. They were placed in the most prominent location possible, a physical manifestation of the value Nadal was assigning to their collective sacrifice. The symbolic weight was crushing in its clarity. This wasn't charity in the patronizing sense. This wasn't a wealthy person throwing money at a problem. This was one of the sport's greatest champions declaring unambiguously that Ayla was worth investing in, that her family's presence mattered, that her financial struggle shouldn't determine their access to witnessing her dreams. During the match itself, the camera cuts kept finding Ayla's mother's face. Her expression oscillated between wonder and overwhelming emotion. This woman, who had worked countless hours, who had made impossible choices, who had watched so many crucial matches from her phone or a computer screen, now she was here, courtside, legitimized, elevated, honored. Every time Ayla looked toward the stands between points, she saw them, her family, together, her mother's hands clasped in prayer or anxiety or pride, that complicated combination of emotions that only a parent watching their child compete understands. That image, Ayla on court, her family in the stands where they finally belonged, all of it made possible by a man who had already achieved everything tennis could offer, became the defining visual not just of this match, but of a turning point in the sport. The match itself became secondary to the narrative. Nobody remembers the exact scoreline with the same clarity they remember the tears. Nobody recalls the specific tactics employed with the same vividness they recalled the expression on Ayla's face when she realized what Nadal had done. This was mentorship elevated to an art form. This was legacy protection. This was a champion using his power not to consolidate it, but to distribute it. On the surface, Rafael Nadal bought plane tickets and stadium seats. That's what the transaction looked like in financial terms. But beneath that surface sat something far more consequential, a philosophical statement about the future of women's tennis, about institutional responsibility, and about what true mentorship demands from those who've already won everything. Nadal understands tennis at a level few humans ever will. He comprehends the sport's economics, its power structures, its unspoken hierarchies. He knows that behind every overnight success story lies either systematic advantage or extraordinary sacrifice, often both, and he was consciously choosing to disrupt that equation for Ayla. The gesture functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there was the immediate practical impact. Ayla's family could finally be present for crucial tournaments. That presence itself matters physiologically and psychologically. Athletes perform differently when their support system is visible. The nervous system calms slightly. The motivation becomes tangible rather than abstract. When you can see your mother's face in the stands, every struggle carries additional meaning. But Nadal's intelligence extended beyond that obvious benefit. He was making a statement about institutional failure. Every tennis organization, every tournament director, every corporate sponsor operating in women's tennis had the financial capacity to subsidize family attendance for developing players. None of them had done it systematically. None of them had prioritized it. Nadal's action exposed that absence as a choice, a collective choice by an industry to accept preventable financial barriers as normal. The deeper philosophy, however, was about legacy protection. Nadal knows that women's tennis needs new superstars, not just for the competitive health of the sport, but for the economic viability of the entire ecosystem. Every new champion expands the fan base, increases media rights values, creates sponsorship opportunities. Investing in Ayala wasn't just altruism, it was enlightened self-interest. Nadal was betting that by protecting her development, he was protecting the future of the sport he loves. There's also an element of this that relates to Nadal's own journey. His family was his foundation. His father's guidance, his uncle's coaching, his mother's support, these weren't luxuries, they were essentials. Nadal recognized that Ayala had talent, but lacked the structural support system that Nadal had taken for granted. By purchasing that section, he was essentially saying, "Your family deserves to be there the same way mine was there for me." Additionally, this gesture challenged the entire sponsorship and development model in professional tennis. It asked uncomfortable questions. Why should family presence be a privilege determined by financial circumstance? Why haven't tournament organizers created accessibility programs for young players' support systems? Why does the sport tolerate a system where talent and circumstance can be separated by money? Nadal's action created a new standard. Going forward, any tournament that didn't find ways to accommodate young players' families could be pointed to as failing in comparison. Any wealthy player who didn't follow Nadal's example could be quietly questioned about their commitment to the sport's future. He had raised the bar for what generosity looks like in professional tennis, and that bar now applied to everyone. The move also demonstrated something about power dynamics in sports. Nadal possesses enough influence and financial security that he can take bold action without worrying about professional consequences. Younger players, coaches dependent on sponsorships, tournament directors reliant on sponsors, they operate within tighter constraints. But Nadal, secure in his legacy, could risk the gesture without calculation. And that's precisely why it resonates so profoundly. The shockwave reverberated through professional tennis with the force of an earthquake. But unlike natural disasters, this earthquake was constructive. It exposed fractures in the sport's foundational structures and suddenly made them impossible to ignore. Within hours of the announcement, other players began publicly acknowledging Nadal's gesture. Serena Williams released a statement about the importance of family access and athletic development. Novak Djokovic, who had always maintained his own mentorship philosophy, posted about supporting young talent. But here's what mattered most. These weren't empty endorsements. They were the beginning of a conversation about systemic change. Tournament organizers scrambled to respond. The Grand Slam associations, which control the sport's most prestigious events, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Why didn't they have family accessibility funds? Why hadn't they prioritized this years ago? The implicit accusation hung in the air. If Nadal could afford to support young players, certainly the billion-dollar tennis industry could create institutional programs to do the same. Sponsors faced their own reckoning. Companies that had invested heavily in women's tennis found themselves questioned about their commitment to development and access. Some moved quickly, announcing initiatives to support young players' family attendance at tournaments. Others remained silent, their inaction now interpreted as tacit acceptance of inequality. The business calculation had shifted. Social media became a forum for grassroots athletes to share their own stories. Young women from developing nations spoke about watching tournaments from internet cafes because they couldn't afford courtside seats. Parents described missing crucial matches because flights cost more than monthly salaries. The narrative that ALS family struggle was unique dissolved. Suddenly, it was revealed as systemic, widespread, and preventable. Ayala herself became the focal point of a broader conversation about tennis equity. Journalists began investigating developmental programs in different countries. They discovered vast disparities in support structures. Players from wealthy nations received institutional backing that their counterparts from less affluent regions could never access. The sport's talent development was unintentionally, or intentionally, depending on perspective, biased towards geographic privilege. Coaches and development programs took notice. Several established institutions began reaching out to young players from less wealthy backgrounds, offering training opportunities they previously couldn't afford. Nadal's gesture didn't just help one player, it created permission structures for institutional investment in underprivileged talent. The most profound ripple effect, however, was philosophical. Nadal had demonstrated that greatness could be measured not just by trophies and records, but impact on the sport's trajectory. He became the template for what a retiring champion could accomplish, not just commentary from the sidelines, but active intervention in the sport's future. Other legendary players began examining their own potential contributions. Some launched foundations, others began mentorship programs. Nadal had established that legacy extended beyond personal achievement into institutional transformation. Corporate tennis shifted as well. Sponsorship deals began including clauses about accessibility and development support. Media companies highlighted stories about young players overcoming financial obstacles. The narrative of tennis transformed from pure competition to competition plus equity, and that change had originated with Nadal's single decisive action. Most importantly, the message to young players worldwide crystallized. Your talent deserves support, and that support should be available regardless of your family's wealth. Nadal had rewritten the social contract of professional tennis development. When historians eventually examine this period of women's tennis, they'll identify a before and after. Before this moment, the sport operated under an assumption that had calcified into invisibility. Access was earned through financial advantage. After this moment, that assumption became increasingly indefensible. Nadal's gesture didn't just change Alex Eala's immediate circumstances, it changed the conversation about what mentorship looks like in professional sports. Historically, mentorship meant coaching tips, tactical guidance, maybe some encouragement during difficult moments. Nadal expanded that definition into something more holistic. Mentorship means ensuring that a young player's talent isn't suffocated by circumstance. Mentorship means using your power to redistribute opportunity. Mentorship means recognizing that greatness sometimes needs financial scaffolding to reach its potential. For ALS specifically, the impact extended far beyond having her family courtside. The gesture communicated something fundamental. You belong here. Your potential is recognized not just by coaches or scouts, but by the greatest players in the sport's history. The psychological weight of that validation cannot be overstated. Every athlete carries doubt. Ayala's doubt had been compounded by financial insecurity. Nadal's action answered that doubt in the most unmistakable way possible. The broader implication, however, relates to the future of women's tennis globally. The sport's competitiveness has always been somewhat skewed towards nations with established infrastructure and wealthy populations. Players from the Philippines, India, Latin America, Eastern Europe, they had to overcome not just athletic competition, but geographic disadvantage. Nadal's gesture created a new template. Legacy players could act as equalizers. They could identify talent regardless of origin, and they could invest in removing barriers that have nothing to do with athletic ability. This opens possibilities for the sport that extend far beyond individual matches or tournaments. Imagine if multiple retired champions adopted similar approaches. Imagine if mentorship networks formed specifically to support young players from underdeveloped tennis regions. Imagine if the sport's greatest achievers viewed their greatest contribution not as winning records, but opening doors for the next generation. What Nadal demonstrated is that true dominance extends beyond the court. It extends into influence, into resources, into willingness to disrupt the existing system in favor of a more equitable one. He could have retired, consulted, endorsed products, and remained comfortably relevant. Instead, he chose to actively reshape his sport's development structure. That choice defines legacy differently than any trophy count ever could. For young players everywhere watching this moment, the message is clear. Financial circumstances don't determine destiny. Tennis organizations and wealthy players now have a template for supporting emerging talent. The sport is slowly acknowledging that greatness often needs assistance in the early stages, assistance that's logistical and financial, not just technical. Ayala's journey from here becomes a referendum on whether Nadal's investment was justified. Her success would validate this new approach to mentorship. Her struggles would raise questions about whether access alone is sufficient, or whether the sport needs to address other systemic inequalities. Either way, the conversation has fundamentally shifted. The legacy Nadal is now building extends beyond his own career. It encompasses the careers he enables, the players he believes in before the world recognizes them, the families he reunites with their champions, and the sport he is gradually transforming from an exclusive domain into something approaching an equitable competition of pure talent. This is what the future of women's tennis looks like. Not just better players, but players empowered by a system that finally recognizes that talent without access is tragedy, and that tragedy can be prevented by those with the means and wisdom to act.